Good morning and welcome to the Zicklin Talks Business webinar series for November 2023. My name is Bruce Weber, and I'm the William Quaker Dean of the Zicklin School of Business here at Baruch College, City University of New York. My pleasure today to introduce our two guests and our school's namesake, Larry Zicklin. We're going to be hearing about the work that the two journalists have done on leading consulting firm McKinsey & Company. Our two speakers will be Walt Bogdanich and Michael Forsythe. Walt joined the New York Times in 2001 as an investigative reporter on the business desk, and since 2003 has been an investigative reporter for the Times. Prior to joining New York Times, he was an investigative reporter for 60 Minutes on CBS and also ABC News, and before that had been an investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He earned degrees in political science at the University of Wisconsin and then from Ohio State in journalism. He's the winner of 3 Pulitzer Prizes, one in 1988, 2005, 2008, and in 2010, Walter received the Gerald Loeb Lifetime Achievement Award. Tremendous recognition of his work in investigative business journalism. Our second guest is Michael Forsythe. Michael is an investigative reporter at the New York Times, which he joined in 2013, served in the China and Hong Kong offices of the New York Times. Before his joining the New York Times 10 years ago, he was a reporter at Bloomberg News, also covering issues in topics in China and lots of connections in Washington, D.C. He was a winner of the George Polk Award in 2013 for a series on the elite families of the Chinese Communist Party. Before becoming a journalist, Michael served in the U.S. Navy in Asia. He's a graduate of Georgetown University, doing an undergraduate degree in international economics, and Harvard University, where he obtained a master's degree in East Asian studies. So with that, Larry, I pass it over to you for what promises to be a great webinar on McKinsey and the entire management consulting industry and its ethics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Walt and Michael, for coming here. I know it's an encumbrance on your time. So let me begin. Let me begin with the idea. What is the genesis of the idea of writing a book about McKinsey?
Well, we learned that it is big, powerful, and unaccountable. And as a journalist, that's catnip. When a business, particularly one as powerful as McKinsey, as influential, as widespread as McKinsey's influence is, tells us that our business is none of your business, well, as a journalist, that makes us want to know what your business is. And that's pretty much how we got started.
And when you say unaccountable, is that because it's a private versus a public company and doesn't make as much information known?
Well, there are a lot of private companies that are more accountable than McKinsey. McKinsey, as a principle, says that, they're not going to disclose anything that they do publicly. Private companies, for instance, that get public contracts have to disclose information. Private companies that are stockholder owned, they have to disclose information. McKinsey doesn't. And that's their business policy. And it certainly was intimidating when we started to think that how are we going to report on this big secretive organization that I've told people reminds me of probably more, they hold more secrets than the CIA. And then they also advise the CIA. So maybe it's not that surprising.
Maybe they'll learn a lot from the CIA about how to conduct their business.
Yeah, I think they can learn from each other, I suppose.
Given the nature of the secrecy of McKinsey, how difficult did that make it when you conceived of the idea and decided to go ahead with the book?
I'll take a shot at this. Well, I mean, it was difficult, because, we were afraid a lot of people wouldn't talk to us. At first, I think when we were doing our first story, which was back in 2018, and this was before we even knew we were ever going to write a book, they did make some of their people available to us, including their managing partner at the time, a guy named Dominic Barton, who went on to be Canada's ambassador to China. And so we did talk to a few people then, but our main, source of luck, or I guess breakthrough, was through the magic of LinkedIn. Actually, so you can imagine that a McKinsey consultant is a LinkedIn warrior, and ex-McKinsey consultants are on LinkedIn, and so we had some luck reaching out to them, and talking to them, the former consultants, some current ones as well. Sometimes, they had a point of view they wanted to get across, and so that kind of started the ball rolling. Once we did our first story, that brought more people kind of out of the woodwork, people, maybe at McKinsey who were a little upset at some of the work they were doing. And one thing led to another. And in the course of reporting over 4 years, we talked to at least 100 current and former McKinsey consultants.
And did you talk to the company again? By the company, I mean the current management.
So after our first story, it was a bit difficult. They really didn't want to make themselves available for a lot of interviews, either on background or on the record. But we had always had a cordial relationship with their spokesperson, who would answer, to the best he could, the questions we posed for every story we were doing. Is that about right, Walt?
Yes, he was very helpful in the sense of telling us if we were on the wrong track or we had some false information. He would straighten us out. So, we've kept that cordial relationship throughout the entire process, surprisingly so. I'm not sure the management of McKinsey feels that way, but their public-facing spokesperson was very considerate and understanding of what we were trying to do. That didn't mean he told us what we wanted, but he did his best under the constraints of management.
You write a series of articles about McKinsey. What was the point at which you decided to go from writing these articles to writing a book?
Well, I wrote one book 30 years ago, and there's a reason I waited 30 years. This is a hard undertaking and something you don't do lightly. You got to think of your family, you got to think of your employer, you got to think of your partner. Are Mike and I going to get along for however long it's going to take? Yes, it turns out we did. But it's when there's a critical mass that we've gotten together in terms of information, and we think that we can tell the full story of this company in a way that hadn't been told before. And after we discussed it with our agents, who frankly were very excited, literary agents who were very excited about this idea. So we thought that gave us confidence to put forward a proposal, and a lot of people wanted to publish it, and we picked who we thought was the best editor in the business.
And did the Times give you a certain amount of time off to do the book?
They did. Yeah, we took the year 2020 off. It was during the pandemic. I would kind of joke that nobody even noticed we were gone because everybody was out of the office. So it was both an ideal time to write a book, and also the worst time because it was hard to travel around and do interviews then.
I should point out that the New York Times has used McKinsey as a consultant over and over, as has its competitors, the Washington Post. So I knew that, and that gave me some pause. But the Times, to its credit, published our stories and didn't look back. So that's why I work there, and that's why Mike works there, and that's why we're proud to be Times reporters.
And since the book was published, what have you heard from McKinsey, from the company itself?
Just through others who said that they felt that it did not portray enough of their good deeds. And we feel that we certainly did not ignore their good deeds, but that's not why we did the book, because we felt that McKinsey has the wherewithal to publicize those good deeds. And it does, like every 20 seconds on the internet. I'm being only slightly facetious. They're always talking about some study that they've done or whatever. And so we just thought that there was another side to their story. And that's what we decided to look at it. But they haven't pointed out anything yet that we're aware of that we got wrong.
Right. But, even with all the decades of experience that, Walt especially has, but me too, we were obviously very concerned about making any mistake. And so if you look at the book, there's, over 1,200 footnotes. We just went over it so carefully so that we didn't make any, factual errors. And when the book did come out, they put out a statement, and that's about it, saying that, well, this really doesn't reflect who we are, is what they said, that there's so many good things McKinsey does too. And we're not disputing that. They do some nice things as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the summaries that we wrote at the end of our epilogue was that there's no denying that McKinsey does good. What people wish is that they would do less harm, and I think that in some ways sums up our feelings about the company.
So let me just quote what three partners, obviously given permission by McKinsey to say this. I'm quoting them now. Serving the interests of stakeholders, employees, communities, and the broader public is not necessarily at odds with the imperative of profit. Sometimes it's possible to have it both ways. Serving the interests of stakeholders is not necessarily at odds with the imperative of profit. On the contrary, we think it is essential to achieve that goal, and more specifically, to make profitability sustainable over the long term. I'm assuming that's what they try to do for their clients. Is that fair?
Well, yes, profitability for the upper management and the shareholders, but certainly not for the workers or the communities in which they live, because we've shown the devastating impact on the workers. They're the forgotten element here. Look, Mike and I do not wish that McKinsey, decides to go into poverty. We accept the fact that profits and it's part of the capitalist system. It's just we felt that there ought to be, the people that we talked to felt there ought to be a few more guardrails there.
But the fact of the matter is, not to be contentious, it's the company that hires McKinsey to consult with. It isn't the employees, and the companies are trying to do what they can to compete in a difficult world. Why is McKinsey not doing its job when it concentrates on company profitability and not workers?
Mike,
I don't know if we dispute that they're not doing their job. They're working for the C-suite of these companies, who, as you said, hired them. And we're also not disputing the fact that, it's a company's prerogative and it's their duty to shareholders to make a profit. I guess where the book's genesis comes from is that work they do, which is around the world and not just with companies, but with governments as well, does real harm. And that's what we portrayed in the book. And so I think a lot of these CEOs, CFOs, COOs who work with McKinsey partners, they do get their money's worth, and that's why they keep getting hired. But it's the effect of that and the incredible influence this company has, working with almost all of the Fortune 500 companies and all the big companies around the world and governments around the world, that really, I think, made this book.
Is McKinsey too powerful?
Well, I mean, that's something for others to decide. I mean, we just were able to establish that they were powerful and more influential, using their own words, when compared to their competitors in the consulting business. Are they too powerful? Without kind of the guidelines that many people think they should have, guardrails, I should say. Yes, maybe they are too powerful. And I think that they've made efforts recently to try and address some of the questions that have been raised about their conduct by, instituting better vetting of clients and whatnot. But, I also should add that the managing partner who pushed for that, pushed hard for that, was voted out of office after one term, which really hadn't happened in decades. So apparently McKinsey partners who vote on that managing partner did not appreciate losing that kind of income, or appreciate someone telling them that they were not behaving as they should.
And if there was a lack of guardrails, who should create the guardrails? Is it government? Is it the regulators? Is it the companies themselves? Is it the McKinseys of the world themselves?
It's a really good question. Obviously, if you're a law firm, there's the law, there's professional regulations you have to abide by. Accounting firms the same way. There's really nothing in this set of professional services firms. The consulting firms. There's no laws other than the basic statutes on the book. For any criminal conduct. So certainly some people in Washington have suggested, at least for government work, that they do be required to more, wholesomely, fully disclose any conflicts of interest that they have for government work. And obviously there's a model for that, with the whole bankruptcy process. There's always these conflicts that have to be disclosed there. But it certainly is an issue because, they're not a regulated industry, definitely.
I think there's also the issue of more transparency when they work in government, because this is taxpayer money that they're using. I mean, government is outsourcing its responsibilities to this private, nonprofit, but not, I shouldn't say nonprofit company, to this private company. And there's an obligation then to explain how they use that money and what they used it for. So I think there's also that element that's necessary in addition to disclosing conflicts of interest.
Are the people at McKinsey unique in some way? Where did they get their people? Where do they hire them from? Who are they? Are they different from the people at other consulting concerns?
Go ahead,
yeah.
Mike.
I think they are a bit different from, at least the people, your normal person on the street. They do overwhelmingly hire from, Ivy League schools, things like that, Oxford and Cambridge. And they, are competing for the same students who maybe want to go to work at Goldman Sachs or Google or Apple. And their pitch to these students, is that, come to McKinsey because, it's not just making a buck, that you can actually make a difference in the world because our work has a real impact. And also along the way, you can learn, and they'll say, a toolkit of skills, that will really teach you about the way American or world business works. And so when you leave McKinsey, and this has to be unique among companies,
they say
where you have
you leave McKinsey.
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy. What company does that says, well, when you leave McKinsey, and of course not everybody does, but the implication is if you leave, let's say if you leave, you're going to have this whole set of skills. Not a lot of companies do that. I think there's an expectation when you are recruiting that you're saying, why would you ever want to leave our company? You're going to stay there for the rest of your life. But it is a very strong appeal. They'll say, hey, we do work in Africa, putting vaccines out, like polio vaccines in Nigeria. We do all this great work. Can you really do that at Goldman Sachs? No, but you can do it at McKinsey. So they do appeal to the idealism of young people at these schools. And to some extent, they've been successful.
And if I could add one point, the fact that they do hire these idealistic people, that is to our benefit as reporters, because they're decent people, they're good people. They want to do good. They want to help the less fortunate. That's why many people get into this company. But what happens with idealistic people is when they see that the company that's hiring them and is behaving in a way that is not in concert with what they were told, then they get angry, they get frustrated, and oftentimes they call Mike and me, and we accept their calls under any circumstances.
Was that the greatest source of your insights into McKinsey? Were dissatisfied current or ex-employees?
I would think so, yes, but there's something else that as investigative reporters we always seek, and that's to try and obtain corroborating information, because we understand that people have an axe to grind, and we take that into account. But what our reporting led us to is that we were the first to obtain their client list and how much they were paid. And with that information, we were able to show the conflicts of interest between McKinsey represent or advising opioid makers or drug companies at the same time that they're advising the Food and Drug Administration. So yes, we did talk to a lot of people who were dissatisfied, but not in a mean sort of way. I mean, they weren't like, I want to get McKinsey. Nobody ever said that. They were deeply troubled by what they had seen, and they cared about the company, and they cared about their clients. And that speaks to the kinds of people that McKinsey hired.
How critical in the hiring process do you think the fact is that McKinsey's alums are CEOs of some of the most prestigious companies in the world, I guess?
That's certainly part of their pitch. And it's so true. The CEO of Google right now, Sundar Pichai, is a McKinsey veteran. And Lou Gerstner, the longtime CEO of IBM, the head of Morgan Stanley right now, Gorman, he's outgoing right now, I guess, but leaving, but he's a McKinsey alum. And so many, prime ministers, treasury, officials are McKinsey alum. That is obviously a very appealing pitch that McKinsey can make to new recruits, definitely.
And I'm assuming they pay very well.
They do.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh yeah, they do. I think it's very akin to investment banking or something where obviously as a business analyst or even a junior like associate out of getting your MBA, you might be making $200,000, a little more than $200,000 a year. But then once you start moving up the ranks. So when you're an engagement manager, which I kind of link, kind of is akin to a sergeant to me, and then when you make a partner, your salary goes way up, into the millions of dollars when you include the bonuses and everything.
We mentioned the word conflicts earlier on, and the way I think about it is McKinsey, as you point out, work for government agencies, regulators, I assume, and they work for companies. How do you do both?
Well, I don't think you do both if you're an honorable company, because I don't think you can. I mean, they will say that there's this Chinese wall between the government workers and the private consultants, but that exists more in their minds than in reality. Because we were able to find, for instance, that the same consultants who were advising Purdue Pharma and opioid makers were also at the same time advising the Food and Drug Administration. So look, I think for a long time, McKinsey did not want to get involved in government consulting because they thought achieving the kind of change they wanted would take too long because of the political process. But then they saw their competitors doing it and they jumped in with both feet. And now, advise governments not only in states across this country, but in governments around the world.
Wait a minute, Walt, when you say they saw change and they thought about change before getting into government consulting, do they come with an agenda that we want to do certain things, and the companies and the agencies are vehicles for them to create that change?
I don't know that I would take that cynical a view. I mean, I think they follow the money. And I don't think they go into it thinking, okay, we're going to consult for these agencies that are regulating our private companies with the purpose of trying to, achieve something we couldn't otherwise. I think they do it because there's money, and there's money on both sides. And in their minds, that's not a problem.
Yeah, I would add to that. If you look at their consulting for private companies, though, often you do see some uniformity in what they're saying across industries, because they like to propagate the latest business fads or trends or whatever. So, for example, some of their work with tobacco makers, you saw in the slide decks these slides from other industries about how much money, how advantageous it would be if this company offshored their work. Hey, move your factory to China and look what this, other company, a tool and die company, look how much money they made. So you might want to try it too. So there are, this is a very powerful effect of McKinsey, their ability to propagate ideas from industry to industry, and the idea of offshoring and how American companies can make so much money by moving overseas is one of the biggest ones that they pushed very hard in the 1990s and into the early 2000s.
So one of the things, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Go-
I was just going to say they were huge proponents of globalization until the criticism started mounting about what exactly does this mean and who are the victims of globalization. And then they started to backtrack a little bit and they said, look, we still support globalization, but there should be a however. And from now on, we're going to emphasize the however. Well, there weren't many howevers for quite a few decades. And they supported it to the detriment of workers and to the detriment of the communities in which those workers lived.
I'm being argumentative now, I understand.
It's okay.
But if McKinsey says the client's interests come first, which they do, and it's in the client's interest to offshore their manufacturing, what is McKinsey to do to save the client or to increase the bottom line if offshoring makes economic sense? And remember, and we're getting into difficult ground here, I know, that most of these companies are incorporated in Delaware, and Delaware law says you have to manage in the best long-term interest of the corporation. And by virtue of the corporation, I assume it means the shareholders. What else is McKinsey to do but to do what Milton Friedman espouses and create greater profits?
Mike?
Obviously, before Uncle Milton came around, in the 50s and 60s, I think there was a very different mindset among businesses in America, and the idea of shareholder and, the shareholder and the can do no wrong, and we must serve, the shareholder, and we have a fiduciary duty to the shareholder, was not as endemic, in American business culture as it was, starting maybe in the 70s and 80s. You would know much more than that. So, McKinsey was a very different company and was advising many different things back in the 50s and 60s, than it was after the ideas of Milton Friedman really, sunk in there. This is not something we addressed in the book. I'm on a little thin ice here because I'm not a philosopher or, a big thinker on the ideas of shareholder value. Certainly it is in the prerogative of the businesses, if they hire McKinsey and this is what they want to have done, then McKinsey's going to do, what they're asked. But you mentioned, and I think McKinsey does take this very seriously, the idea that the client's interests come first. But I think that's the whole, if there's a point to our book, it's that there's a very big conflict when the client's interests come first. But what if your client is a bad actor? What if your client is getting America addicted on opioids when there was no opioid crisis before? What if your client is getting, is continuing to sell cigarettes 50 years after cigarettes were, found to cause cancer, 50 years or more? And so, what if your client is executing journalists, in Saudi Arabia, or building islands in the South China Sea that are militarizing that whole area? So it's that conflict. And I certainly also, understand, and I think Walt and I both understand that there's some definite advantages to globalization. There are some definite benefits to the United States to globalization. It's not a one-sided thing. That's certainly something we accept as well.
When you talk about conflicts, why is McKinsey different from accountants and lawyers that have clients all over the place in the same industry? Or maybe the accountants are working with regulators and working with the regulated at the same time. Is McKinsey unique?
I think there's a big difference. For us, when we want to interview a lawyer, they have to do a conflict check, to see if there's any issues, any conflicts of interest. And obviously with accountants, I would imagine that there's also some firewalls and things that are in statutes that they can't, do accounting work for some similar companies. There's nothing, there's no accounting board, or anything like that would prohibit McKinsey from advising companies in the same industry. And they're very upfront about the fact that they do that, and have been doing that for decades.
And do you think they use the information that they learn at one company and employ that expertise at a second company in the same industry?
People that we've interviewed suspect that that is in fact the case. And what they do is they set sort of the industry standard. So I'm talking to company A, and this is the way you ought to be operating. These are the standards that you ought to follow. And then they go to a competing company and they tell them the same thing. And in essence, they're setting sort of a pricing level. It's not illegal what they're doing, but I guess it comes pretty darn close in some cases, according to people we've talked to, towards sort of, if not, in detail price fixing, certainly getting to too close to that to be proper.
Right. We really didn't explore the antitrust issues, with McKinsey, but it was, really kind of revealing, looking at all the work they did with opioid makers, and much of their work with the opioid makers came out because of the lawsuits that states attorneys general, had against Purdue Pharma and some of these other opioid makers. So a lot of the slide decks and emails and everything that McKinsey had with these companies came out, and it was quite striking, the fact that they were advising so many of these opioid makers and using the same terms, turbocharge. They talked about turbocharging opioid sales, at Johnson & Johnson, and they talked about doing this at Purdue Pharma, and certainly we're talking about how do we respond as an industry to challenges from the FDA or whatever. So I think it's a really interesting area, this whole antitrust issue that really hasn't been explored enough yet.
Sounds like an idea for another book. As long as we're talking about opioids, and we all know that McKinsey was consulting with Purdue, how did McKinsey get into this? What were they hired to do as consultants? What was their assignment?
They had a deep background in advising pharmaceutical companies. And so that established them as sort of experts in the field. And they saw this company, which was small, Purdue Pharma. And it wasn't a huge company. It had, one or two products, one successful product. And they wanted to grow. They wanted to get bigger. They wanted to leave more of an imprint. And the owners of that company were quite famous people, and they wanted the Sacklers, and they wanted to achieve greater heights in business. And they saw McKinsey as a way to do that. So McKinsey actually rode along with the drug detail people, the drug salesmen, pharmaceutical sales people, when they were speaking, writing out and talking to doctors. They rode along with them in the cars and talked to them. So they were advising them at every step of the way on how to maximize sales. And I think what a lot of people found troubling about it is that they were targeting the most vulnerable populations, people that I think they knew were desperate for a quick fix, who were vulnerable to their sales pitch, and it worked. And then later, eventually, when the government awoke from its slumber and started realizing that, my goodness, we need to regulate this a little bit, the opioid industry a little better. And they came up with proposals to try and mitigate this crisis, which was affecting communities all across the country. And one of the things they came up with was McKinsey was sort of decided that, okay, we will help you get around some of these restrictions that the federal government is imposing. In other words, the government was cracking down on the pharmacies, on the drug distributors, saying you're moving too much of this product. So one of McKinsey's solutions to that was to recommend an alternative delivery system, which would get around those restrictions, which are intended to save lives.
Did McKinsey start its consulting work for Purdue after they were found guilty, although they pleaded guilty in 2007 to some criminal charges about misleading doctors?
No, it was before. So they started the work around 2003, I think.
I think.
Yeah. Was it around then, Walt?
Yeah. I think 2004, but I don't know.
Yeah. And
Let me check it and this book on McKinsey. I'll look it up right now.
I hear it's a good book.
yeah. And so yeah, they were working with them before, and then they were found guilty, as you said. That would have been 2007, and then actually the work really picked up tremendously after that legal action against Purdue in 2007, and that's really when they deepened it. And in addition to advising them on how to boost sales, to turbocharge sales, as Walt said, there was another team, from McKinsey at Purdue that was working on this alternative delivery system, these tamper-proof OxyContin pills, and how to get that approved with the FDA. And it was a whole strategy about, what do we do? How do we approach this, so that we can get FDA approval? And then McKinsey would advertise the fact that they had so much experience with the FDA to get more business. That was part of their pitch. Look at our experience.
In fairness to McKinsey, and we of course want to be fair to McKinsey, I should point out that there were people, very influential people within the firm, senior partners in the firm, who did not appreciate what McKinsey was doing for Purdue Pharma and pushing opioids in the middle of this epidemic. And they objected to it and they spoke against it. But they were overruled, which brings up a larger point that I think we should make. Mike and I do not view McKinsey as an evil organization. They do a lot of good work, and we've gotten to know a lot of the people who work there, obviously, and some have become my friends. So this is not an evil organization. It has made some unwise decisions, and that's what we focused on, because we're journalists and that's what we do.
I used to run a business in my other life, and there were certain clients we wouldn't do business with. I just didn't want to do business with them because I knew they were radioactive. And I have a friend I teach with who used to run a law firm, a well-known law firm. And he also told me that there were certain people they just didn't want as clients. After this 2007 case, where Purdue pleads guilty to misleading doctors about the opioids, and the type of narcotic they are, I just don't understand how McKinsey went back to work for them. Mm-hmm. Is there something that's come up in your research?
It's a really good question. Obviously they were, earning big fees. I think we did the math, and over the 15 years or so they were working with Purdue Pharma, they took in about $80 million in fees from Purdue. But it's a very good question on why they continue to do this. I think one of the reasons, this is just a hypothesis here, is because their work is so confidential. It's, if you're a law firm and you represent a bad client and they go to court, your name's going to be on that suit. Everybody's going to know. And if you're an accounting firm, same thing. And if you're a banker and you've got a bad client, well, then SEC filing might, reveal all. But with a consulting company, that work is confidential. And it was only because of these, lawsuits against Purdue Pharma that, in discovery, these things came out, that the work McKinsey was doing was revealed. They went, I don't know, Walt, they went more than a decade working with Purdue Pharma, including many years after the 2007 guilty plea, that that it was just not known. We didn't know it until January of 2019, when the first documents were made public by the then Massachusetts Attorney General, now Governor Maura Healey.
I mean, the truth is that McKinsey turned advising companies that sold addictive products into a profit center. It was not only multiple opioid manufacturers, but it was vaping companies and it was cigarette companies. And I have a long history of reporting on the cigarette industry and the lies that they've told over decades. And, we've said over and over again about how smart these people are that McKinsey hires, which leads us to the conclusion they had to know what was going on. They had to know the harm they were causing. And somehow they were able to justify it in their own minds so that they could sleep at night. And I guess, there were casualties from that kind of attitude.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we understand, every company, every person needs a lawyer, right? So even Philip Morris needs lawyers. Do they need the best lawyers in America? Well, they think so, but there's a right to counsel. That's part of our system of government, right? But not every company, there's no right to a management consultant. And I think that maybe McKinsey had the attitude that, well, everybody has a right to consultant, so we're even going to be advising these tobacco companies, and they advised tobacco companies up until 2021. So that's well more than 50 years after the Surgeon General told the whole world that these cancer sticks cause cancer, and they continued that work. So of course they knew what was going on.
Do you find that the lack of government regulation may seduce a McKinsey into saying, well, if the government doesn't find it objectionable, why should we?
I'm sure that's some of their logic. And it's one of the reasons they're able to sleep at night. Yeah, one could tell themselves that. But I don't know. That's Mike. What do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's obviously their work with Purdue Pharma. Well, that's actually not the best example. Their work with Philip Morris, and tobacco companies around the world was, probably legal, but was it the right thing to do? As you said, there were people you didn't work with, and certainly by 2021, everybody knew that these companies were not there for the greater good and did incredible harm.
I can't remember if it was in your book or somewhere else that I saw a slide presentation for Purdue where McKinsey laid out several options and included a rebate for every OxyContin overdose attributable to pills they sold. And they actually made that presentation that if there's an overdose and you have to pay something, we'll give you a rebate. Was it in your book?
It was. We wrote a story on that while we were writing the book, because there were some documents that had come out actually it was in the Purdue bankruptcy case that these documents came out.
Wasn't it CVS?
Yeah, CVS. It was a proposal they had to, if there's overdoses or opioid use disorder, that they were pitching an idea that maybe these pharmacies could get a rebate from the makers, the opioid makers. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I don't think they carried out that recommendation.
That's correct.
Right. We went to CVS and Anthem and these people and said, was this ever undertaken? And they came back and said no. And we put that in a story. So certainly, it was, I guess they were spitballing ideas. That might not have been one I would have spitballed.
Could you talk about McKinsey's role in helping some of the insurance companies, State Farm and Allstate, being among them, in their dealings with their insured clients?
Yeah, so this story goes back decades, and it's kind of illustrative of the fact that of McKinsey's real influence on whole industries, right? So it started with Allstate. Allstate was a very conservative company, conservative with a small c, owned by Sears, and they did auto policies and all sorts of things. And then they split off from Sears in the early 1990s, and they became their own company. It wasn't a super profitable industry, but very solid. And McKinsey came in and said, we can help you drive up your profits. And the solution they had was to put more of a squeeze, on the claimants and make it, harder essentially for people to get paid out for policies. And they devised a system and, alongside the Allstate people, to especially, focus on making it really hard for plaintiffs' lawyers to go after Allstate. They were just going to throw the book at these plaintiffs' lawyers who were going after, representing claimants. So anyway, profit at Allstate goes way up at this point. And then State Farm and other insurance companies hire McKinsey as well. and they start implementing, similar policies. So, profit, in this sector definitely went up. Share prices definitely went up. Shareholders were certainly rewarded for this, but it was a real change in what had been a fairly staid industry where, people who worked there as claims adjusters, had very satisfying lives, helping out people who, had an auto accident or a fire, and so it changed the industry is what our reporting found.
And when you talk to some of the folks at McKinsey, the employees, the ex-employees, were they sorry about that? Was there any remorse?
Walt, I don't know if there was so much.
I don't think there was.
No. Yeah.
Let me ask you one last question about clients, because I see my friend Gwen there. The countries they represent that are autocracies, or in the case of Saudi Arabia that kill reporters and cut them up in pieces and all that, how do they explain that? Or is it, well, if the U.S. government can do it, we can do it?
I think their explanation is that, well, yes, we're there because we want to help that country get better and treat its citizens better. They think that they can improve things by being on location. I mean, if they think that with the Saudis, well, I don't know what they're smoking, but because Saudis aren't gonna give a damn about their citizens, as I think they've proven over the years. So, Mike, you did more reporting in that area.
Well, I mean, so China is a good example. I mean, they did some good things, in China. So one of the things McKinsey does is spread, what they call best practices around the world. So for the insurance industry, for example, China had a, Stalinist era insurance industry, not much of one. So McKinsey comes in there with all, the ideas from U.S. insurance companies and everything to help them reform that industry, and it really takes off. So some of the Chinese insurance companies are among the biggest in the world now, and they're profitable. Yay, McKinsey, that's great. But the issue with countries like China is that a lot of the consultants there are locals, and the people there, start identifying with the government, and they don't see, sometimes they miss the bigger picture. So for example, McKinsey didn't see a problem, it looks like, them advising this state-owned company in China that is also helping the Chinese government build these islands in the South China Sea that are militarizing the South China Sea. That's a real problem, because a much bigger client for McKinsey is the US Pentagon, which is obviously strategically, very opposed to what's going on there. And they miss the fact that they have their annual party in China only a few thousand meters away from a detention camp for the minority Uyghur population, which we wrote about in a front page article. So when you have people in Saudi Arabia and China working for McKinsey that identify with that country's government, you're gonna have these problems, I think.
Gwen, I'm sorry, Walt.
No, I was just going to add one quick point. There was this after Khashoggi was chopped up and killed. There was the so-called Davos in the desert, where all these big corporations would get together in Saudi Arabia and work out big deals. Well, apparently there were a good number of companies that were so offended by what the Saudis did to Khashoggi that they pulled out. One company that didn't was McKinsey, and I guess that speaks volumes about their ethics.
Gwen, you have some questions from our audience.
Yeah, there are many questions. We won't get through them all, but I want to thank the audience for many of them that you submitted. When investigating McKinsey, one viewer asked, "What shocked you the most?"
Oh gosh, I guess the opioid situation probably did as much as any. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, that was jaw-dropping.
Okay, actually, one of the other questions was McKinsey just paid a settlement of $230 million. And the question is, do you think that's a fair outcome?
Well, that's 230 million on top of the 600 million that they had paid earlier. So they've now paid $800 million. And
Right.
yes, it's a satisfactory outcome for McKinsey because now they're not being prosecuted. And that put an end to the government investigations and the lawsuits. So they bought their way out of this jam, which is what they did in South Africa as well.
And here's another interesting question. Were you contacted directly by any dissatisfied McKinsey employees? And if so, what did they want to tell you?
And we absolutely were. Yes. Whenever we published a story, it seemed a few people did come out. But as Walt said, it's not like they were out to get McKinsey. They never were. I think they were just really disturbed, by some of the articles we and others were writing, and some of the things they were seeing within the firm. So definitely, they were a very big help for us, dissatisfied, McKinsey consultants. Yes.
All right. Actually, I have a question here, and it came to Dean Weber. Dean Weber, after this discussion, what advice would you give to Baruch students who are in the job market, about to graduate, and might want to consider a job in consulting?
Yeah, thanks, Gwen. I appreciate that. I'll, in full disclosure, share with the audience that my father was a McKinsey consultant in the 1960s in Chicago and knew Marvin Bower. The firm had 200 people in it when he was there, and he did move on and started 2 consulting firms of his own. So I think there's some good practices that developed there over time. And I also heard from him several times that he was concerned by the growth of the firm and maybe it diverging from its original focus and principles. But I think the advice for students is you only have one reputation, and you want to uphold that reputation wherever you are, and to really understand your own morals and ethics. And as Walt and Michael explained, there is an option within McKinsey not to work for a particular client. And we all know there's gray areas, there's things that are legal that happen to be immoral. And we've heard about many of those today. So I think what students really want to recognize is that there's prestigious firms that sometimes will challenge your own ethics. And there's probably firms whose ethics can be improved by you bringing your own concerns to the table. These companies have a number of different generations of people working in them. And I think today's younger people do hold a number of issues closer, and including climate and social justice and equity in our economy and society. And I think as a young person, these companies do want to hear from you, and let them be aware when you're concerned as an employee about some work that's going on for a particular client. Many of you will go into professional services firms, so you've got to make sure you treat your own reputation as your most valuable asset. Thanks for asking, Gwen.
Oh, well, that did come from the audience. And here's a question for Walt and Mike. Some of the audience members are current Baruch students, and they're asking what advice would you give them if they might be interested in investigative reporting?
Well, it's an honorable profession. I guess you would expect me to say something like that. It's been besides my family, the greatest pleasure really of my life to be able to work hard and to make a difference in this world. And I think Mike feels the same way. So, I mean, if you're curious and you're not afraid of asking questions and you're not afraid of speaking truth to power, then this is an avenue you might want to pursue. Because, my goodness, we need as many honorable, fair-minded investigative reporters as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just, this is not answering that question, but just echoing on what Dean Weber said, that, I think it's, we often, meet students who say, I just got a job at McKinsey and I'm starting in a few weeks. And invariably what we tell them is, one word, congratulations. And it's not like we don't want people to go work for McKinsey or its competitors, BCG, Bain, or anything. But we do hope that, if you read the book and just think about it, that you'll go in with your eyes wide open. And as the dean said, you only have one reputation. And so, it's important that you, make the right decisions and ethical decisions when you're there. But there's a lot of, there is a lot of good work you can do, and there's much you can learn from the consulting industry. And we're not trying to, discount that at all.
Larry, any last words on this discussion?
I just have to tell you how much I enjoyed reading that book. I've recommended it to so many of my friends. And when they say to me, I really don't like to read business books, I tell them it's more than a business book. It's a book about life in the United States right now. And you should really read it. It's about social justice. When McKinsey comes to town, I congratulate you. I can't wait to read your next book.
Thank you. And it's an honor being on your being questioned by you.
Thank you very much.
You're very nice.
Our last notice here is that our December 12th webinar will be on income inequality. Is it increasing? And if so, what should be done about it? We are honored to welcome as our guest Professor Paul Krugman. He is a winner of the Economics Nobel Prize. He is a distinguished professor of economics at the Graduate Center of CUNY, and he is a distinguished scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. We are also we are honored to welcome our own Professor Ted Joyce from our Finance and Economics Department. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Walt, very much for a great discussion. And thank you, Dean Weber.
Thank you all.